June 1943. A cramped office in Algiers. Two of America's greatest generals locked in a collision that would define modern warfare. One man demanded to conquer every battlefield on Earth. Sicily, Italy, France, the Pacific, all at once. The other held a fountain pen and 3 pages that would shatter that dream. No screaming, no confrontation, just words. Words that transformed ambition into duty, ego into excellence, and a warrior drunk on glory into a weapon of calculated precision. George Patton wanted to be Alexander the Great. Dwight Eisenhower needed him to be something far more valuable, a gear in the machine of victory. What followed was genius restrained, fury harnessed, and a legend forged not in defiance, but in obedience. This is the story of the letter that changed World War II. The ivory-handled revolvers that became relics, and the moment one man learned that true greatness isn't found in fighting everywhere, but in fighting exactly where you're needed most. June 8, 1943, Algiers, North Africa. The sun hung low over the Mediterranean, casting long amber shadows through the shuttered windows of Allied Forces headquarters. Inside a cramped office, thick with cigarette smoke and the metallic scent of mimeograph ink, Supreme Commander Dwight David Eisenhower sat alone at his desk, fountain pen poised above cream-colored stationery. Outside, the muezzin's evening call echoed across the whitewashed colonial architecture, mingling with the distant rumble of transport trucks ferrying supplies to the Tunisian front. The air was still, the kind of stillness that precedes a storm. On his desk lay a cable from Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr., commander of the U.S. 7th Army. It was not a request, it was a demand. Patton wanted to lead invasions in Sicily, Italy, France, and the Pacific simultaneously. He wanted to be everywhere at once. A modern-day Alexander carving his name across 3 continents. The cable was vintage Patton, brash, profane, electrified with martial ambition. Eisenhower read it twice, then set it aside, and began to write. What emerged from that pen over the next hour was not simply a letter. It was a masterclass in command philosophy, a meditation on ego and strategy, a quiet, devastating rebuke wrapped in the language of respect. The document would never be published in Eisenhower's lifetime. It would remain filed away in classified archives, a private monument to the collision between genius and megalomania, between battlefield brilliance and the brutal mathematics of coalition warfare. But to understand what Eisenhower wrote that evening, one must first understand the man he was writing to and the crucible that forged their fractured partnership. George Smith, Patton Jr., was born into war. Not literally, but spiritually. His family bloodline ran red with Confederate generals and Revolutionary cavalry officers. He grew up on tales of Thermopylae and Cannae, memorizing Homer before he could spell. As a boy in San Marino, California, he staged mock battles with toy soldiers, refighting Waterloo and Gettysburg on the Persian rugs of his family's estate. He attended Virginia Military Institute in West Point, where he finished a middling 46th in his class. But first, in swordsmanship and equestrian drill. Patton believed in reincarnation. He was convinced he had fought as a Roman legionnaire, a Greek hoplite, a Napoleonic hussar. War, to him, was not policy by other means. It was the purest expression of human vitality, the arena where great souls revealed themselves. He read military history the way monks read scripture. He wept openly at battlefield, overcome by what he called the proximity to eternity. By 1943, Patton had already made his name. In North Africa, his tanks had roared across the desert like mechanized Mongols, crushing Rommel's flank at El Guetar. He restored the shattered morale of the U.S. II Corps after the humiliation of Kasserine Pass, instilling a savage discipline that bordered on cruelty. Soldiers feared him. Soldiers loved him. He wore twin ivory-handled revolvers and tailored uniforms so immaculate they seemed to mock the dust and blood of combat. He spoke to his men in language so profane it could blister paint, yet he could quote Virgil in the original Latin while standing knee-deep in mud. But Eisenhower knew something Patton did not. Genius without restraint is indistinguishable from madness. Patton's demand to fight in every theater was not born of idle arrogance. It was the logical extension of his entire worldview. He saw war as a grand stage and himself as its lead actor. The European theater? Too small. The Mediterranean? A sideshow. The Pacific, a rival production stealing his spotlight. He wanted it all. The invasions, the headlines, the place in history. He had written to his wife, Beatrice, just weeks earlier, "I am destined to lead the greatest army since Napoleon. Eisenhower knows it. Marshall knows it. They are fools if they do not use me everywhere." What Patton expected was validation, endorsement, perhaps even awe. What he received instead was silence, then a letter that arrived 3 days later, sealed and marked personal and confidential. Eisenhower began with courtesy, as he always did. "Dear George," the letter opened, "I have received your recent communication and have given it the consideration it demands." This was classic Eisenhower. Calm, procedural, the tone of a man diffusing a bomb. Then came the pivot. "You are, without question, one of the finest tactical commanders this army has produced. Your instincts in armored warfare are unmatched. Your ability to inspire men under fire is a rare gift. But George, you must understand, wars are not won by lone cavalrymen charging into every skirmish. They are won by coalitions, by logistics, by subordinating personal ambition to collective purpose." The language was surgical. Eisenhower did not attack Patton's competence. He attacked his premise. The letter continued, "You ask to command in every theater. Let me explain why that is not only impossible, but undesirable." What followed was a paragraph-by-paragraph dismantling of Patton's request, grounded not in emotion, but in operational reality. First, the mathematics of manpower. Eisenhower noted that the Allied forces were not infinite. Every division, every air squadron, every landing craft was spoken for, allocated months in advance through agonizing negotiations between Washington, London, and Moscow. To pull resources from the Pacific to satisfy Patton's ego would delay MacArthur's island-hopping campaign. To divert Mediterranean forces to the Channel would leave Italy vulnerable to German counter-attack. "You speak as if armies are chess pieces that can be moved at will," Eisenhower wrote. "They are not. They are living organisms, dependent on supply lines that stretch across oceans. You cannot fight in Burma and Normandy simultaneously because the ships carrying your fuel and ammunition cannot be in two places at once." Second, the politics of coalition warfare. This was the part that stung most. Eisenhower reminded Patton that the Allies were not a monolithic force. They were a fragile alliance of democracies, each with its own priorities, its own casualties, its own domestic pressures. The British had bled at Dunkirk and endured the Blitz. The Soviets had lost millions at Stalingrad and Kursk. "You want glory, George," Eisenhower wrote, his words edged with something close to anger. "But our British allies want survival. The Russians want revenge. And the American people want their sons home alive. Your personal ambitions are a luxury we cannot afford." Third, the nature of command. Here, Eisenhower turned philosophical. He wrote about the loneliness of supreme command, the burden of making decisions that would kill thousands in the hope of saving millions. He contrasted Patton's swashbuckling ethos with the grinding, unglamorous work of coordination, negotiating with Churchill, placating de Gaulle, managing Montgomery's prickly pride. "You see war as an arena for heroism," Eisenhower wrote. "I see it as a machine that must be calibrated. You want to be Caesar. I need you to be a gear." Throughout the letter, Eisenhower returned to a single image: Patton's ivory-handled revolvers. Those pistols were more than weapons. They were totems, symbols of Patton's self-mythology. He had carried them since the Pancho Villa expedition in 1916, firing them in Mexico, brandishing them in Morocco. They appeared in every photograph, gleaming against his hip like twin declarations of identity. Eisenhower understood their meaning. In one passage he wrote, "You wear those revolvers like a knight wears his sword, and there is honor in that. But George, the age of knights is over. This war is won by engineers and quartermasters, by code breakers and factory workers. You can shoot a German with your revolver, but it takes 10,000 rivets to build the landing craft that gets you close enough to aim." The revolvers, in Eisenhower's framing, became a metaphor for obsolescence. Beautiful, romantic, and tactically irrelevant in an age of industrial total war. They represented the tension at the heart of modern warfare, the collision between individual heroism and mechanized mass destruction. Patton polished those revolvers every night, treating them with the reverence a samurai gave his katana. But Eisenhower knew that wars in 1943 were won not by men with revolvers, but by nations with factories, not by cavalry charges, but by production lines that stamped out Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them. Eisenhower's letter concluded with a directive that was simultaneously an assignment and a leash. Patton would command the 7th Army in the invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky. He would have his battle, but he would share the stage with British General Bernard Montgomery. He would operate within a coalition framework, and he would, above all, follow orders. "You will have your chance at immortality, George," Eisenhower wrote in the letter's final lines, "but it will come on my terms, in service of a plan larger than yourself. If you cannot accept that, I will find someone who can." There was no room for negotiation, no ambiguity. The letter ended without warmth, without the usual pleasantries. Just a signature, D.D. Eisenhower. Patton received the letter on June 11th. He read it 3 times, then threw it across his tent. His aide, Charles Codman, reported that Patton paced for an hour, muttering curses that would have made a longshoreman blush. But he did not resign. He did not protest through official channels. He obeyed. Because beneath the bravado, beneath the pearl-handled pistols and the profanity, George Patton understood one thing. Eisenhower was right. The war was bigger than any one man's ambition. It was bigger than glory. It was an existential struggle that would be won not by romantic gestures, but by cold logistics and colder discipline. July 10th, 1943. The 7th Army stormed the beaches of Sicily under Patton's command. It was a masterpiece of controlled aggression. Patton's tanks swept across the island's interior with a speed that seemed to defy geography itself. While Montgomery's British 8th Army ground slowly up the eastern coast against stiff German resistance, Patton executed a bold flanking maneuver. He drove his armor northwest, capturing Palermo in a lightning thrust that stunned both allies and enemies. The ancient Sicilian capital, untouched by major combat since the Middle Ages, fell to American forces in 72 hours. Patton stood in Palermo's central plaza on July 22nd, dust-covered and grinning, while his tanks rumbled past Baroque churches and Norman fortifications. It was vintage Patton, audacious, theatrical, effective. The American press went wild. Time magazine put Patton on its cover, describing him as a fighter out of the past, a warrior in an age of technicians. Newsreels showed him addressing his troops, revolvers gleaming, voice crackling with martial fire. For a moment, it seemed Patton had been vindicated. He had proven he could deliver victories that matched his rhetoric. But the victory was incomplete. Eisenhower had given Patton the battle, but not the freedom. Every major decision required approval from General Harold Alexander's headquarters. Every supply request went through Allied channels. Montgomery received priority for fuel and ammunition, since his forces faced the bulk of German armor. Patton chafed under these constraints, writing bitterly in his diary, "I am a thoroughbred being ridden by a man who fears to gallop." Then came the slapping incidents. On August 3rd, Patton visited the 15th Evacuation Hospital near Nicosia. He moved through the wards, distributing Purple Hearts, offering words of encouragement to wounded men. Then he encountered Private Charles Cool, a 26-year-old from Indiana, sitting on a cot with no visible injuries. Cool was shaking, suffering from what would later be diagnosed as severe battle fatigue, what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. Patton, who viewed psychiatric casualties as moral failures, demanded to know what was wrong. When Cool replied that he couldn't take it anymore, Patton exploded. He called Cool a goddamn coward, slapped him across the face with his gloves, and ordered him back to the front lines. A week later, at the 93rd Evacuation Hospital, Patton repeated the offense with Private Paul Bennett, this time drawing his revolver and threatening to shoot the man for cowardice. Word spread. Medical personnel filed reports. Journalists uncovered the story, though they initially sat on it at Eisenhower's request. But the incident could not be contained forever. By November, columnist Drew Pearson broke the story on his national radio broadcast, igniting a firestorm. Congressmen demanded Patton's court-martial. Editorials called for his dismissal. Eisenhower, under pressure from Army Chief of Staff George Marshall and American public opinion, was forced to act. He privately reprimanded Patton, requiring him to apologize to the soldiers he had assaulted, to the medical personnel who witnessed it, and to every division in the 7th Army. It was a humiliation unprecedented for an officer of Patton's stature. Then came the real punishment. Patton was relieved of combat command and assigned to lead the 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, in England. On paper, it was a promotion, command of an entire army group preparing for the invasion of France. In reality, it was a phantom. FUSAG did not exist. It was an elaborate deception, part of Operation Fortitude, designed to convince German intelligence that the D-Day invasion would strike Calais instead of Normandy. Patton spent 6 months giving speeches to non-existent divisions, inspecting dummy landing craft made of canvas and plywood, generating radio chatter that German signal intelligence would intercept. It was the greatest actor in the American military performing for an audience of enemy spies. For a man who craved combat the way other men craved oxygen, it was torture. Patton wrote to Beatrice, "I have been reduced to playing tin soldier while real soldiers win real battles. He watched from England as the D-Day invasion succeeded without him, as Bradley and Montgomery led forces across French beaches, as his former subordinates earned glory that should have been his. He was 58 years old, aging out of war, and it seemed his career would end not in battlefield triumph but in administrative purgatory. The man who had demanded to fight in every theater was now forbidden from fighting in any. But Eisenhower had not destroyed Patton. He had refined him. The months of exile forced Patton to confront the consequences of his own temperament, to recognize that battlefield brilliance without discipline was a liability. When Eisenhower finally released Patton back to combat command in July 1944, something had changed. The transformation was subtle but profound. Patton took command of the Third Army in Normandy on August 1st, and within days, he unleashed one of the most spectacular offensive operations in military history. Operation Cobra, the breakout from the Normandy hedgerows, shattered German defensive lines and sent Patton's armor racing across France at speeds that astonished even his own staff. But this time, Patton coordinated. He deferred to Bradley, now his superior. He accepted logistical constraints without public complaint. When Eisenhower ordered him to halt at the Seine River to allow Montgomery's forces to catch up, Patton fumed privately but obeyed. When fuel shortages forced him to pause his advance toward the German border, he adapted rather than raging. He was still profane, still theatrical. He still wore the ivory revolvers, but he was no longer insubordinate. He had become what Eisenhower needed, a weapon that could be aimed and fired, rather than a wild force that might explode in any direction. Documents from this period reveal a shift in Patton's private writings. In his earlier diaries, he spoke of himself as destiny's instrument, a reincarnated warrior fulfilling some cosmic purpose. But after his return to combat in 1944, the language changed. He began writing about duty, about serving something larger than himself. After the relief of Bastogne, during the Battle of the Bulge, when Patton's Third Army executed a 90-degree pivot in 48 hours to rescue the encircled 101st Airborne, he wrote, "This was not genius. This was what soldiers do when their brothers are in danger. I merely pointed them north." It was the closest George Patton ever came to humility. The ivory revolvers remained on his hip, but their meaning had shifted. They were no longer symbols of personal glory, but reminders of tradition, of continuity with warriors past. In his final months of combat, Patton began giving away personal items to young officers, small tokens, and words of advice. He gave one of his revolvers to a tank commander who had distinguished himself at the Battle of Nancy. The gesture was shocking to those who knew Patton. Those pistols had been extensions of his identity. To surrender one was to acknowledge that the war was ending, that his time was passing, that new men would carry the tradition forward. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Patton's Third Army had driven deeper into Germany than any other Allied force, liberating concentration camps, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners, crossing the Rhine, and pushing into Czechoslovakia. Eisenhower assigned him to govern Bavaria in the chaotic aftermath, but Patton proved spectacularly unsuited for occupation duty. He made inflammatory statements about the Nazi Party, employed former SS officers in administrative roles, and clashed repeatedly with Eisenhower over denazification policies. On October 2, 1945, Eisenhower relieved him of command for the final time. Patton never fought again. On December 9, 1945, his staff car collided with a truck near Mannheim, Germany. Patton suffered a broken neck and was paralyzed from the neck down. He lingered for 12 days, conscious and alert, joking with nurses and dictating letters. On December 21st, he died of a pulmonary embolism. He was buried in the American Military Cemetery in Luxembourg, among the soldiers he had led. His grave marker was identical to theirs, a simple white cross, no larger, no grander. It was the final surrender of ego, the ultimate subordination to something larger than himself. Eisenhower received word of Patton's death while working at his desk in the Pentagon. He set down his pen, the same fountain pen he had used to write that letter, in June 1943, and sat in silence for several minutes. Then he drafted a statement for the press. General Patton was one of the most brilliant commanders in American military history. His loss is a tragedy for the nation and for all who served with him. It was measured, official, carefully worded. But that evening, alone in his quarters, Eisenhower wrote a private entry in his diary. "George is gone," it read. "He was impossible. He was indispensable. I spent half the war trying to control him and the other half wishing I had 10 more like him. He wanted to be Alexander. He became something better, a soldier who learned that duty matters more than glory." What Eisenhower had written in that letter in June 1943 was not just a rebuke, it was a prophecy. He had predicted that Patton would have his chance at immortality, but only on terms larger than himself. And that is exactly what happened. Patton did not become the lone warrior he imagined himself to be, the Alexander carving his name across continents. He became something more meaningful, a component in a coalition, a brilliant tactical mind harnessed to strategic purpose. A man whose genius was made useful precisely because it was constrained. The ivory revolvers sit today in the Patton Museum at Fort Knox, Kentucky, displayed behind glass alongside his medals and maps. Visitors photograph them, drawn by their symbolic power, their suggestion of a more romantic age of warfare. But those who study the artifacts closely notice something unexpected. The grips show wear. The pearl handles are chipped. These were not ceremonial objects. They were working tools, carried through mud and blood, drawn and holstered 10,000 times. They were beautiful, yes, but they were also functional. They served a purpose within a larger system. That is what Eisenhower understood, and what Patton eventually learned, that in modern war, even symbols must serve the machine. The age of lone heroes had ended. The age of coordinated systems had begun. Patton's tragedy and his triumph was that he lived on the border between those two eras. He longed for the past, but fought in the present. He wanted to be remembered as a warrior king, but earned his place in history as a subordinate commander who learned painfully and slowly to serve a cause larger than his own legend. In the end, Eisenhower's letter was proven correct in every particular. Patton did not fight in every theater. He fought where he was ordered, when he was ordered, how he was ordered. And in doing so, he achieved a form of immortality, more durable than any he might have grasped through undisciplined ambition. His name endures not because he was a maverick who ignored authority, but because he was a genius who, when it mattered most, chose duty over ego. The sun that set over Algiers on June 8, 1943, when Eisenhower wrote that letter, has set and risen more than 30,000 times since then. The men who fought under Patton are nearly all gone now, their voices silenced, their battles fading into history. But the letter remains, archived and preserved, a testament to a moment when one man forced another to choose between greatness and mere glory. Patton chose greatness, and in that choice, he became worthy of the legend that still surrounds his name. Not because he was unrestrained, but because he learned restraint. Not because he demanded everything, but because he accepted what was given and made it enough. That is what Eisenhower wrote when Patton demanded to fight in every theater. A reminder that true warriors serve not their own ambitions, but the freedom of others. And that the highest form of courage is not charging into battle, but accepting one's place in the larger design of victory.